The restaurant was alive with noise. Cutlery tapping against plates. Glasses clinking. Low conversations blending into a steady hum. It was the kind of evening where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. Then a sharp burst of laughter cut through the room. Heads turned. At a small corner table sat Bruce Lee, relaxed, focused on his meal, completely unbothered by the noise around him. He wasn't trying to stand out. No spotlight. No audience. Just another customer enjoying dinner. Across the room, a towering 250-pound wrestler noticed him. At first, it was just a stare, then a smirk, then a comment, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. A few people chuckled nervously. Others shifted in their seats. The wrestler stood up. Heavy footsteps echoed against the floor as he walked closer, drawing more attention with every step. His confidence filled the space. His presence demanded it. Bruce Lee didn't look up immediately. He calmly placed another bite in his mouth. The contrast was striking, size versus stillness. Another loud remark, this time directly aimed at him. And that's when the atmosphere changed. Because Bruce Lee slowly lifted his eyes. No anger, no fear, just quiet awareness. The wrestler pushed his chair back with a slow scrape against the floor, the sound cutting through the restaurant's chatter. He rose to his full height, broad shoulders stretching beneath his shirt, casting a shadow over the nearby tables. Conversations began to fade as people noticed him standing there, confident and amused, clearly aware of the attention he was drawing. A few patrons exchanged glances. Some recognized his build, the kind that didn't just suggest strength, it announced it. He carried himself like someone used to being the biggest presence in any room. The smirk on his face only amplified that impression. Across from him, at a smaller table near the wall, Bruce Lee remained seated. He didn't stiffen. He didn't glance around for support. He didn't rise to meet the energy. He simply continued sitting, posture relaxed, shoulders loose, breathing steady. If you looked closely, you would notice that nothing about him seemed rushed or unsettled. There was no visible reaction to the wrestler's attempt to dominate the moment. That contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side stood visible power, height, mass, confidence that came from physical advantage. On the other side sat quiet composure, controlled, observant, unreadable. The wrestler took a few slow steps forward, each one deliberate. It wasn't aggressive yet, but it was intentional. He wanted to be seen. He wanted the room to feel the difference in size. Nearby tables fell silent. Someone whispered, "Is this really happening?" Another leaned back slightly, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. Phones weren't out. No one wanted to escalate it, but no one could look away either. Bruce Lee finally set his utensils down, not dramatically, not loudly, just carefully. His eyes lifted, calm and focused, meeting the wrestler's gaze without challenge, without submission. It wasn't defiance. It was awareness. He wasn't ignoring the situation. He wasn't pretending it didn't exist. If anything, he seemed more present than anyone else in the room. His stillness didn't signal fear. It suggested calculation. The wrestler, expecting a reaction, didn't get one. And that lack of reaction began to shift the energy. Confidence thrives on response. But Bruce Lee offered none. Instead, he observed, measured, assessed. The room felt tighter now, like the air had grown heavier. People could sense something building. Not chaos, not yet, but pressure. Social pressure. The kind that forms when pride meets composure. And in that silent standoff, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about size anymore. It was about control. The wrestler closed the distance with slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall felt heavier than the last, not because of the sound, but because of the attention it carried. Conversations had completely stopped now. The only noise left in the restaurant was the faint hum of the lights above and the quiet shifting of people in their seats. Every eye followed him. He stopped just a few feet from Bruce Lee's table, towering over it. The smirk hadn't left his face. If anything, it had grown sharper. He leaned slightly forward, making sure his presence felt imposing, unavoidable. Then he spoke again, this time louder. Not just a passing comment. Not casual teasing. It was the kind of remark designed to perform, designed to entertain the room. designed to reduce someone to a spectacle. A few uneasy laughs broke out, not because people agreed, but because public tension makes people uncomfortable. Some looked down at their plates. Others stared, waiting for a reaction. Bruce Lee didn't respond immediately. He finished chewing, swallowed. Then, with complete control, he placed his utensils down on the plate. No slam, no sharp movement, no visible irritation, just intention. That small, quiet action shifted the atmosphere more than any shouted insult could. The wrestler noticed it. People nearby noticed it. Because when someone remains completely steady under pressure, it creates something unexpected, uncertainty. Bruce Lee slowly lifted his head. His posture didn't change much, but his focus did. His eyes locked onto the wrestler. Not with anger, not with challenge, but with clarity. It wasn't emotional. It was observational. The wrestler had expected something else. A defensive reply. A sarcastic comment. A visible flinch. He got none of it. And that absence began to work against him. Confidence feeds on reaction. It grows when the other person appears rattled. But Bruce Lee wasn't rattled. He wasn't shrinking. He wasn't escalating either. He was simply present. The wrestler shifted his weight slightly. It was subtle, but it was there. His shoulders tightened. His tone sharpened as he tried again, repeating himself louder, hoping volume would create dominance. But dominance doesn't come from noise. It comes from control. The room could feel the shift happening in real time. What started as mockery was slowly turning into discomfort, but not for Bruce Lee. For the wrestler, because calm under pressure is disarming. When someone refuses to mirror aggression, the aggressor loses rhythm. The psychological balance starts to tilt. Bruce Lee stood up slowly, not abruptly, not to intimidate, just smoothly. He didn't invade space. He didn't puff his chest. He didn't change his breathing. If anything, he looked exactly the same as he had seconds earlier, composed, centered, aware. But now they were face to face. The size difference was obvious. The wrestler's frame was significantly larger, his arms thicker, his presence physically overwhelming. Yet something about the moment didn't feel lopsided. It felt measured. Bruce Lee's calm wasn't passive. It wasn't avoidance. It was deliberate restraint. And restraint is powerful. Have you ever watched someone stay so steady in a tense situation that it unsettled the other person more than shouting ever could? That's what was happening. The wrestler attempted one final verbal jab, short, sharp, aimed to provoke. But his voice didn't carry the same confidence it had earlier. There was a hint of strain now, a subtle awareness that he wasn't in full control of the moment anymore. Bruce Lee didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't boast. He simply maintained eye contact. 5 seconds can feel like an eternity when tension is that thick. The entire restaurant felt suspended, waiting. Not for violence, but for resolution. Because at this point, it wasn't about strength. It was about composure. And everyone in that room could sense it. The psychological balance had shifted, quietly, completely. The wrestler leaned forward slightly, his hand reaching out in a gesture that could have been interpreted in multiple ways. Some thought he might grab or push Bruce Lee. Others believed he was merely trying to intimidate, to make his presence felt, to see how this smaller man would react. Every subtle shift in his posture was loaded with expectation. The room held its collective breath. Patrons froze mid-bite, mid-sentence. A server paused at the next table, unsure whether to intervene. Everyone in the restaurant seemed to sense that something was about to happen, but no one could predict what. Bruce Lee remained perfectly still. His eyes tracked the movement without flinching. His breathing was slow, deliberate, controlled. There was no panic, no anticipation of violence in his expression. Yet every muscle in his body seemed aware of the energy in the room. It was as if he could feel the subtle tension in the air, read the wrestler's intention before it had fully formed. And then, in a moment so swift that it defied ordinary perception, Bruce Lee acted. It wasn't a flurry of motion. There was no exaggerated leap or dramatic lunge. There was no aggression, no attempt to overpower. His movement was fluid, almost invisible to the casual observer. One smooth, controlled shift of his body, a precise placement of weight, a subtle pivot, and the balance of the wrestler was thrown off. The wrestler, who had moments before been radiating confidence, suddenly faltered. His hand froze mid-motion. His eyes widened slightly. The smirk that had been fixed on his face began to fade, replaced by a flicker of doubt. It was subtle, almost imperceptible if you weren't watching closely. But in that second, the psychological dominance in the room shifted entirely. People gasped, some audibly. Others simply sat frozen, unable to believe what they had witnessed. The transition from mockery to shock was instantaneous, leaving the audience mentally scrambling to process the change. The wrestler's posture sagged just enough for anyone observing to understand that his control over the situation had slipped. Bruce Lee didn't push. He didn't shove. He didn't even speak. And yet, the result was undeniable. The room, which had been buzzing with anticipation and tension, went completely silent. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with the invisible force of psychological authority that Bruce exuded without a single word. The moment lingered. Patrons who had been leaning forward to see the confrontation now sat rigid, trying to anticipate what would happen next. Their hearts raced, yet no one dared move. Every eye was locked on Bruce Lee and the wrestler, fully aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary, the complete recalibration of a social dynamic in under a second. It was a demonstration of control, precision, and calm mastery that transcended ordinary strength. The wrestler's physical size no longer intimidated. The energy of aggression had been redirected with subtlety so refined that anyone who hadn't seen it closely might have thought it a trick of perception. And in that silence, the entire room collectively recognized it. The match of power versus composure had reached a tipping point. Not through force, not through theatrics, but through the quiet, deliberate mastery of timing, anticipation, and awareness. Every person in the restaurant felt it, the weight of those few seconds stretching endlessly. Some clutched their drinks. Others simply stared, mouths slightly open. Phones remained tucked away. No one wanted to miss a single, unbroken moment of this encounter. Bruce Lee's presence was magnetic, almost hypnotic. He had shifted the atmosphere without raising his voice, without making a sound louder than a soft movement. And the wrestler, once the center of attention, was now struggling to reclaim composure, trapped in the reality of someone whose skill surpassed mere physical intimidation. The silent, suspended anticipation created by those few seconds left everyone acutely aware of what true control looked like. And that realization alone had already stunned the room completely. The room was still. Every person in the restaurant seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the expected explosion, the chaos that usually accompanies a confrontation of size versus perceived vulnerability. But it never came. There was no brawl, no plates flying, no chairs crashing to the floor, no loud shouting. The tension, which had seemed ready to snap, instead shifted into something far more subtle and far more powerful. Bruce Lee remained calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threatening gestures. His presence alone redirected the energy in the room. With a few deliberate movements, the restaurant had transformed from a stage of potential conflict into a theater of control. The wrestler, once radiating confidence and dominance, took a step back. The motion was small, almost imperceptible if you weren't paying attention, but the meaning was clear. He hadn't been pushed. He hadn't been struck. He stepped back because he understood something fundamental, something that couldn't be learned from size or force alone. The silence in the room became tangible. Patrons shifted in their seats, unconsciously leaning in as if drawn toward the center of this quiet spectacle. Conversations had stopped. Utensils had paused mid-motion. Even the servers, who had been cautiously observing from a distance, seemed frozen in awe. Bruce Lee's calm confidence was the kind that didn't need validation. He didn't need to shout, to make a spectacle, or to demand attention. His mastery of timing, presence, and mental clarity had already communicated what brute strength could not. He was in control, and that realization was enough to dismantle the wrestler's arrogance faster than any physical confrontation ever could. The wrestler's expression changed. The smirk faded. His eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the shifting perception of the people watching. It wasn't just him who noticed the change. Everyone present was observing. They felt the shift too. The balance had moved. Bruce Lee's subtle dominance created a psychological tipping point. The crowd didn't see a fight, but they felt the quiet lesson unfolding. Size and power are temporary. Calmness, skill, and composure carry far more weight. The wrestler had realized, in a few short seconds, that continuing to push forward would not only be futile, but also publicly embarrassing. This wasn't about humiliation or conflict. It was about awareness. The wrestler recognized that the energy in the room was no longer his to command. The subtle control Bruce exhibited had reset the hierarchy of attention. And in that moment, stepping back wasn't a surrender. It was a recognition of a higher order of mastery. The restaurant, previously charged with nervous laughter and whispers, now vibrated with quiet respect. Patrons exchanged glances, some leaning closer to witness what had just transpired. The tension had transformed into awe. Bruce Lee returned to his meal with the same deliberate calm as before. No celebration, no need to assert dominance. He simply sat with a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. And the wrestler? He retreated slightly, reevaluating, recalibrating, perhaps even reflecting. The lesson had been communicated, not through force, but through composure, precision, and confidence. Power isn't always loud. Skill doesn't need to shout. And calm confidence can dismantle arrogance faster than brute strength ever could. If you were in that wrestler's position, what would you have done in that moment? Double down or step away? Every person in that room, whether directly involved or silently observing, had just witnessed a demonstration of influence without aggression. A turning point that was more psychological than physical, more profound than any conventional confrontation could ever be. The silence lingered for a few heartbeats longer than expected, but then, almost imperceptibly, the tension began to dissolve. What had moments ago been an atmosphere thick with anticipation and uncertainty gradually shifted back towards something more ordinary. Yet the memory of the standoff remained heavy in the air. Bruce Lee returned to his seat with deliberate calm. There was no rush, no dramatic motion, no attempt to draw attention. He simply moved with purpose, each step measured, each gesture intentional. Patrons, who had been leaning forward to witness every second of the confrontation, now found themselves watching him with a new kind of curiosity, one that blended awe with respect. He picked up his utensils again and resumed eating, as though the entire moment had been just another pause in his evening. No celebration, no smirk, no acknowledgement of the eyes tracking him. Just quiet composure. The calm was striking, almost unsettling to some, because it contrasted so sharply with the energy that had filled the room just moments earlier. The wrestler, who had dominated the restaurant's attention with his size and confidence, said nothing more. There was no outburst, no attempt to reclaim authority, no loud comment to reassure himself or the spectators. He had stepped back, both physically and psychologically. In that silence, he communicated more than words ever could, an unspoken acknowledgement that the dynamic of control had shifted. The restaurant began to return to life. Glasses clinked again. The hum of conversation slowly resumed. Chairs scraped lightly across the floor as servers moved to check on tables. People cleared their throats, adjusted their posture, and cautiously returned to their meals. On the surface, it seemed as though everything had gone back to normal. But the difference was subtle, yet undeniable. Every patron now looked at Bruce Lee differently. He was no longer just another man in the room, quietly eating. He was the figure who had transformed the energy of the space with nothing more than composure, awareness, and skill. His size, or lack thereof, compared to the massive wrestler, no longer mattered. What mattered was control. What mattered was presence. What mattered was the calm authority that could alter a situation without aggression. People whispered quietly to each other, recounting what they had just witnessed. Some nodded almost reverently. Others leaned closer to their companions, emphasizing subtle details. The way Bruce had lifted his eyes, the way he had shifted his body, the way he had returned to his meal as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Everyone recognized something rare, an example of mastery that extended beyond physical ability into psychological influence. The wrestler, meanwhile, remained still but composed. His eyes met Bruce's briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. There was no hostility, no lingering arrogance, only recognition, a mutual understanding that one moment had revealed something far greater than physical strength, the power of calm focus, self-control, and strategic restraint. Even those who had initially sided with the wrestler, or assumed he held the advantage, couldn't deny what had happened. There was a lesson in that silence, that influence and authority don't always come from loudness, force, or intimidation. Sometimes they come from the quiet mastery of presence, from the patience to observe, anticipate, and act with precision when the moment calls for it. As the restaurant slowly resumed its rhythm, the story of what had happened was already spreading from table to table. Patrons replayed the scene in their minds, analyzing every micro-movement, every deliberate pause. People who hadn't even been paying close attention found themselves recounting the moment to friends at nearby tables. The impact of those few seconds would linger far longer than the duration of the standoff itself. Bruce Lee's victory, if it could even be called that, wasn't about defeating anyone physically. It wasn't about proving superiority in a traditional sense. It was about demonstrating mastery over circumstance, over perception, over expectation. That was the lesson the room absorbed intuitively. Composure can command respect, calm focus can disarm arrogance, and presence can influence outcomes far more effectively than force ever could. For the first time since the tension had begun, patrons exhaled collectively. The restaurant returned to life, plates clinking, soft chatter resuming. But there was a subtle, permanent shift. Every eye that had witnessed the interaction had registered something profound. Bruce Lee had turned a potential conflict into a demonstration of restraint, skill, and quiet dominance. Not as the smaller man, not as someone overshadowed by brute size, but as the most controlled, aware, and composed person in the room. And in that simple truth, the restaurant, and everyone in it, found a lasting sense of awe.